Alright, so today's tutorial. And actually, let's first talk a little bit about the homework. And I saw Hadex already put up some nice preferences of his from the video, from the default cube video. There's a lot of in there, and the reason stuff like that is so much fun to watch is just to see what people can do with a very basic shape. So what people see in different shapes, where they take their inspirations from, and stuff like that. I think most of you know that I love robots and stuff, so it's quite it's not that weird for me to pick that one that I put in the chat as my favorite. But there's a lot of good ones in there, and it may help you find your style or at least trigger your inspiration a little bit. So for today, we have this default shape of our Totoro, and today we're going to focus on adding a little bit of details, and we still want to keep this mesh nice and clean. So right now we have a very low poly mesh, very nice to actually animate later on as well. So we don't want to add those details by simply adding a lot of geometry to our object. So we're gonna try to keep that nice and clean. And that's going to be a struggle most of the times in any 3D program, is to get a nice balance between details and adding geometry. Alright, so low poly geometry often has less detail, but they are just way easier to animate and they are much more safe for your computer. Alright, so let's try to make those, for example, those eye sockets and those nails and stuff, the nose, the mouth. We're gonna try to make this as easy as possible. And before you start that, you already have to think ahead a little bit, right? So what part will you make in your geometry? And what parts would you make in, for example, texturing? Right? So you may, for example, think that well, the mouth here is very drawn on, so that may as well be a texture. But once you want to animate that mouth, and we're working in 3D, so if you then just draw that mouth on and you look at it from the side, it's gonna look very weird. So the mouth is something we have to model, as well as those eyes. And the nose we're actually gonna model as well. So the textures that I'm gonna be picking will probably only be the color of the actual skin, so the color of the geometry we make. So for example, those things there, the color on the belly that is yellowish, and those foot pads as well, those will be textured. Right, and the rest of the mesh will be geometry. And that is because of one simple reason, and I'm going to show you that very soon. And that's actually going to be the first animating tip that we'll get into, the first animation. Alright, so let's say we want to make the face first. So where do you begin? We only have, let's say, 4 faces in the head, so we need more, otherwise we won't be able to get this this result, of course. Alright, so usually what I try to do is start with the part that has to move the most, for example, because that's the part that needs the best geometry, so to speak. Alright, so that is usually gonna be the mouth, right? It has to open, and especially for animated characters. So in animes, for example, they usually have very strong facial expressions, so the mouth opens a lot. And it opens very wide as well. So the mouth usually needs some good geometry and stuff like that. Now, if you go into edit mode, we're pressing tab, and let me actually enable my screencast keys. There we go. We don't have a lot of geometry, and you may think the face has to be, let's say, right here. It is even below the head, right? Because this little line is the mouth, and it is below the head line. That doesn't really make any sense. So we're gonna make it at least in a part of the face. So we're gonna make it in this area. And to start that off, I'm first going to go to my modifiers and apply that mirror. So hover your mouse over it and press Ctrl A. And actually, I had already created a shape key before. You don't have that, so don't worry. So press Ctrl A on your mirror modifier. And now you will see that you have your full mesh available to edit. And the reason why I do this is because for the mouth, for example, we want to create insets, so with eye. And having a symmetrical inset is only possible if we actually have that mirror applied. So we're gonna do that. And then we're gonna select those two faces because we want the mouth to be somewhere in there. And we're just gonna press I to inset those faces. Just like that. And don't worry about the geometry. All that matters right now is that we have some additional geometry to work with. Right, so we can now just press S to scale this down. And let's press G and X and just move that out a little bit so it matches more with the actual contours of the rest of the geometry. Right, and that's something that you have to keep in mind during the rest of your modeling as well, is that if you inset or extrude stuff, it usually isn't that much in line with your geometry anymore. So you may have to move some edges around. For example, those side edges, if I press 2 to go to edge select mode, I can select those side edges and press G and X and just move them out a little bit. So we get this rounding of the face back a little bit better. Right? So now we still have that nice smooth shape of the face, but we actually have some extra geometry for that mouth. Right? And for the mouth, there is usually a standard kind of geometry that people try to follow. And that is basically that we have to add some kind of a lip structure. Even though we don't see lips in it in the Totoro, we have to think about how it would look realistically. So there's probably going to be some kind of a lip structure, or at least we want the lips to be in the geometry, because that's going to look a little bit better. Right, so the default mouth, what is the easiest to model, right? Because we can also make an open mouth by default. So that's something we have to think about from the start. Do we want it to be open or do we want it to be closed? In general, it may be a little bit easier to work from an open mouth and then close it later on. That's just something that I find a little bit easier. So I'm gonna make it a little bit open and then we can just close it later if we want, because it has to be animated anyway. Right, so what I'm gonna do first is try to create some kind of a lip structure. So I'm going to inset this once again, like that. And I'm gonna move this out a little bit. So I'm gonna press, and actually I'm gonna Control Z this, and I'm going to press S and X. I just scale this down a little bit in the X-axis like that, just so it isn't that pointy. And we might as well just move this point there inwards a little bit too, so everything is nice and smooth. Maybe even move it up a little bit like that. That's fine. All right, so select those faces and press I to inset like that. I'm going to press G and X and move that out a little bit. So imagine that you want this to be the upper lip. All right, so this part, and we want to create some kind of a curved shape because that's the upper lip shape. So I'm going to select those faces, press I to inset once again. There we go. And I'm going to press I once again, inset this, and I'm just going to move it in a little bit, so like that. And then let's extrude it one more time in that Y direction, oh sorry, X direction. So lock it with pressing X, move it in the X direction like that. And now we already have some kind of curve going on there. But we still need to have some kind of a mouth interior as well, in case our character opens his mouth a lot. Then we need to see some kind of, I'm not sure what it's called in English, but you have to see the tongue, the back of the throat. It doesn't simply stop there, right? So we have to think about that in advance as well. So let's extrude that one more time to the right. E and X, like that. Something like that. And then we're going to go into side view and hit the little X-ray button, total X-ray. So now we can actually see the inside of our mesh. All right. So let's think about how the inside of the mouth looks, and it doesn't have to match perfectly. So I'm going to press SX0 now to make this nice and flat, as you can see. And I'm just going to extrude this, and let's scale it up a little bit in the Z direction. Extrude this once again, scale it up a little bit. So this is going to be like the inside of the mouth, where the tongue has its space to move around, and where we later have some space to add teeth and stuff like that. All right, so I'm going to extrude this one more time, like that. And then I'm just going to press Control right mouse. And if I now click somewhere by holding Control and right mouse clicking, it will basically extrude that face set to the mouse. So we can very easily just control where it goes. All right, something like that. And I'm going to do it one more time right there, scale it down a little bit. So this is where it would, for example, disappear into the throat, right? So this could be a throat system. All right, this doesn't mean that you have to make the entire inside of your body. You don't need the stomach, the lungs, and stuff like that. You just need the things that may be visible later on. For example, the back of the throat or the mouth area, stuff like that. So now when we go out of X-ray mode, and if we look into the mouth, we actually have some kind of a structure inside of that mouth that we can actually see back to the throat and stuff like that. So that's always something very valuable to add from the start, in order to prevent things later on that if we open the mouth that you just see geometry, mesh, stuff like that. So now we have a nice open space. Right, so we have a mouth in place, and it may not be the most detailed one, excuse me, but we can change that very easily. So if we go to edit mode, you can see that we've got some pretty nice geometry set up. All right, and if you want to see the geometry after your subdivisions, you can check this little box right there. It says uncaged in your subdivision modifier. You can check that, and you can see how it looks after your modifier. Right, so it's nice and smooth, and the geometry is very, very clean. Right, so we may actually add another edge loop around that mouth just to give it some more room to animate as well. Alright, so if I press Ctrl R and just add another edge loop right there and scale it down a little bit, just so that we have some more room to animate. So if I show this button again, we now just have an extra little edge loop that we can work with to move our mouth. Okay, so that's perfect. Let's go into normal view and let's move around a little bit. So is this still the shape of the face that we want, or is it a little bit different now that we added more geometry? And you can see that this sticks out a little bit more than it was at the start because we lose that curve. So we can change that very easily. Now that we have that geometry set up, we can go to sculpt mode and we can basically just drag parts of the mesh back out. For example, this part of the head, and you can pick the grab tool with G, so that's a shortcut, and then you can just start moving things back in or back out depending on how you want your geometry to look. All right, so this is quite clean already, and I'm going to go back to object mode, and before I'm going to show you how to animate, for example, a face, I'm first going to add some more details, so the eyes and the nose. And the eyes is quite easy actually. All we need is a round circle. So the way to do that is by selecting some geometry, for example these two faces, and by pressing I to inset those faces like that, left clicking, and then we can go to the edit tab. Where is it? I have so many that I can't even read it. There it is. There's an edit button. We added that in a previous tutorial in the add-ons. So if you don't have it, please watch it back, or I'll show you quickly. Go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and search for Loop Tool. Loop Tools, and just enable that real quick. And then we're going to change this into a circle. There we go. It's not a beautiful circle, but it will do, because we can now just scale this down. And let's rotate this so it aligns a little bit better with the rest of the mesh as well. So what I'm trying to do is to, for example, get this edge, this top edge of the circle, aligned parallel with this edge right there, so to the other edge that it's connected to. And then we can just move it out a little bit. So the eyes of the Totoro are quite far to the sides. So I'm just gonna move this to the left a little bit, like that. And now we also have to move it in a little bit, right? Because we are getting some shading things right there. You can't really see it, I think, on stream, but there are some shading issues, and that's because the geometry of this circle is not really in line with the mesh anymore. So I'm just going to rotate this sideways a little bit like that. Beautiful. And let's say we want to move this in a little bit like that, and rotate it a little bit like that as well. So remember, the rotation depends on your camera, so your viewport camera. So if I rotate, for example, my camera like this, and then rotate my faces, it will rotate according to how I look at that face. Right? So that's why I rotate my camera first and then rotate, for example, that face set. So something like this is already nice. And now we can pretty much just inset this once. So let's say we want some kind of an eye socket. We can now inset this. The same thing we did for the mouth. Inset, like that. And we can now just extrude that out. So press E and extrude that inwards. And we have a beautiful eye socket that we can use later on to add some eyes to. Amazing, right? So you can always change the position of the mesh by going back into sculpt mode, dragging this down a little bit. And if you see some weird shading issues, you can always hold shift and left click on a mesh part to make everything a little bit smoother again. Like that. Beautiful. Alright, so we now have a mouth and one eye. Alright, so I'm going to go back to object mode. Press tab to go into edit mode. And I want to mirror this once again so we can get this eye back. And I'm going back from the mirroring and working at the whole mesh quite often. And then something you have to learn is that you need a middle line throughout the entire modeling process, right? A line that you can mirror your mesh in. And right now, this is not straight. All right, this is not completely straight in the Z direction. This one goes to the left a little bit, and this one goes to the right. So I'm going to press 2 to go into edge select, and just double click on those edge loops. Hold shift, double click on that one, until your entire edge loop is selected. And then we can just press S, Y, 0, and it will scale your entire middle edge to the same position in the Y-axis. All right, so now we can go into X-ray mode, press 1, and select our entire right part of the mesh. Remember, we are in select box mode, so press W a few times until you see a little square at that select point. There we go. And just draw a box around your right side of the mesh. Delete vertices and make sure you have everything. I forgot 2 points there. Delete them. Go back to object mode, disable X-ray, add a mirror, and make sure that it is on the Y-axis and swipe it in front of your subdivision modifier, like that. Beautiful. Now we've got a nice symmetrical mesh with 2 eye sockets right away. So I'm going to apply this, and the reason why is because we're now going to work on the nose, and the nose is in the center of our mesh. So I'm now going to apply this mirror again, press tab, and now we have some extra geometry to work with. Right, because we added eye sockets and the mouth. So now we have a very nice geometry that we can use for the nose. And this is going to be our starting point, these 2 faces. And I'm basically going to do the same thing that I did for the eye sockets and the mouth as well. So I'm going to inset this by pressing I. There we go. Left click, and then I'm going to press 2 to go to edge select mode. And I'm just going to move these vertices in a little bit. So I'm going to press double G, and that will move our edge along the edge loop like this. So I'm going to move this in a little bit. Let's see the shape of that nose. I'm going to press 1, select that vertex, press double G, move this down a little bit. Left click this one too. And you can see that I have the mirroring enabled in edit mode, and I think you have that too from a previous tutorial. If not, remember to enable that Y symmetry so that when I move a vertex on the left, it will also move it on the right. Okay, so something like this looks already quite fine. So now I can press 3, go into face select, select those 2 faces, press I to inset those, and just inset them a little bit. Make sure that you don't overdo insets to the point where vertices cross. So if I inset this one more time, too much, you will see that those vertices are gonna cross there. And that's not good for your geometry at all. So try to prevent that at any cost. If you still want to scale this down more without those vertices intersecting, you can just left click to apply the inset and then just scale them down with S instead of I. Something like that, and then just we can just scale it a little bit, scale it in the Z direction by pressing SZ, and then we can just extrude this out. So press E, extrude this out. So this is gonna be our nose. And we can press tab and just get out of that geometry. So that is our nose, and we are now gonna go into sculpt mode to just change some of this geometry around. So now that we have everything set up that we need, so we have nose, eye sockets, and a mouth, we are gonna change some of the layout of this to make it look better. All right, so I'm going to go to front view, and I'm just gonna move this around a little bit, make this a little bit smoother perhaps, like that. Drag it out a little bit, and you can follow me with this, or you can do your own little smoothing option. All right, so you can always make the mesh into what you prefer yourself. I usually just try to get it to a point where I'm satisfied with it, so I lose all of those hard shading things, and then I can just start on the next chapter. All right, so the next chapter I want to show you guys is a lot of fun. All right, so we're gonna go into object mode, and our mesh looks quite all right for now. We can always edit that later because we have a very simple geometry. All right, this is what it looks like after a subdivision. It's very clean, very nice to animate as well. So what we're gonna do is something that we haven't done before, and it has to do with animating a character, shapes, and you could use it for a lot of stuff. And that is in the object data property tab right there. So left click on it, and we now have shape keys. It's the second option, and it is amazing. So if we hit that plus sign, the first thing it adds is a basis. So a base shape key for your mesh. And that means that it's gonna remember this position of your mesh as the basis, as the foundation. All right, so if I now hit that plus sign for our new shape key, you can see that we get all sorts of values that we can assign to this new shape key. And a shape key basically holds the geometry information of your mesh. All right, so if I turn this to 1, and if you want to make changes in your new shape keys, remember to always put that value to 1. Because if I set this to 0 and I go into sculpt mode and I move things around, you won't be able to see those changes until you put the value up to 1. So now that we move it around, we can actually see what we're doing. So remember that you can't really change your shape key shapes if you have your value set to 0, right? So nothing happens then. All right, so we set this to 1. And let's actually try to make a little bit of a different facial expression. And let's go for a boring expression. All right, so something like this, but a little bit more boring. So we're going to try and envision what a boring face looks like. So usually maybe those eyes are a little bit more closed. So we are in sculpt mode. Remember to enable Y symmetry option right there. And we're going to move those eyes a little bit closer together, so the top and the bottom. So it looks a little bit more bored, like that. That looks like a bored Totoro. And the mouth has to be a little bit smaller as well. All right, so we can basically drag this part in, make it a little bit smaller, like that. And if you want to close this completely, you will see that's very hard to do with only grabbing stuff. And that's because you will be moving both the top lip and the bottom lip. If you want to move only one of those, we can use masking. All right, so if you press M, very easy shortcut, M for masking, we can, for example, mask this top lip by just left clicking and dragging. And you will see that a darker color appears on that section. Go over it a few times and it will become nice and gray, like that. And that means that this section is now masked out. Which means that if we go back to the grab tool with G and move that bottom lip now, like that, you will see that the top lip now no longer moves because it is masked out. Alright, and we can invert that mask very easily by pressing Ctrl I, which means that we mask everything except the thing that we just masked. So it basically just inverts the mask, and which means that we can now move that top lip down, like that. So we can actually get it to close nicely, like so, and just keep doing that until you're satisfied with how your closed mouth look, something like that. Alright, to clear out your mask, press Alt M, and the mask is gone, and now you can just move your mouth into the position that you want. Right, very boring. expression. I even want to move this, for example, the ears a little bit, right? A boring look, I envision ears that are a bit more down. So I'm gonna select the snake hook right there, shortcut K as well. Going to go into side view a little bit and just move those ears down a little bit like that. Like this. Actually, Control Z. I'm just gonna make it a little bit more smooth, like that. Go back into the grab tool and just get those ears into the position that you want, right? So now if we go to front view, you can see that the ears are nice and down a little bit, and they look a little bit more bored as well. Right, here comes the fun part. If we go to object mode, we now have a key 1 of value 1. We can rename this to board, for example. And now if you drag this value down to 0, you can see that we're going to switch between that first shape, so the basic, and the board face. Alright, so we basically created a new facial expression. And we can switch between that with this value slider. Very easy. You can even leave it halfway like that. And you can even make it more extreme. It's not gonna look very nice in this case. But for example, if we set the max to 2, we can drag it up more, and Blender will try to express that even more. But because we have the mouth closed completely already, it's going to move the mesh through itself. And it basically makes it look like he's eating some kind of sour candy, right? So that's why for facial expressions, it is sometimes nice to leave that at 1. But this value is animatable, right? So we have this little section at the bottom with our timeline, and you won't see that if you are in the modeling section on the top. You have to be in the layout, and then you will see your timeline. And then you can, for example, right mouse on your value of 1, insert a keyframe, and then let's say 20 frames later, we can change that value to 0. Right mouse, insert keyframe, and now if we play that animation, and I'm gonna set this end to 20 frames just so it loops. If I now play this, you can see that it's gonna switch between those two facial expressions. So that is a very easy way to, for example, animate 2 different facial expressions. And you can do this with more expressions as well. So let's say we delete those keyframes, we clear that out, we set this to 0, we can now add another shape key and go to sculpt mode and try to, for example, make Totoro a little bit sad, right? So we can, remember, we have to set this to 1. Remember that, and we can swipe this up, this down a little bit, make it surprised or just sad a little bit, like that. Boo-hoo. And then we can, let me see, let's make this a little bit smoother. So move that out, like that. It's going to be sad or surprised depending on the eyes. So if we now move this up, like that, it's going to be a little bit more sad. All right, and let's move the entire eye down a little bit like that. And we can even move the nose. Let's say, what looks better? We can move it up a little bit. So we can get very creative with that. And if somebody is sad in cartoons, anything like that, the ears are gonna be completely down. All right, so like that, and we can grab this and make it a little smoother. If we like that, the ears are gonna be down. It's very sad, you see. And we can keep changing things. But let's just see how that looks, right? So for example, like this. And I just keep tweaking this no matter what. All right, I'm gonna go leave it like that. Object mode. And now we have a very sad Totoro. Now if I swipe this back, we're gonna go back to a happy, excited Totoro. Right, and we can now call this, what did I call this? Sad. And we can, for example, have it halfway sad, but also halfway bored. That's such an easy way. It's such a nice way to animate facial expressions later on. Right, so shape keys are perfect. You can make it a quarter sad and 3/4 bored. You can make it a quarter bored and 3/4 sad. Stuff like that is very easy to do. Alright, so once we add eyeballs and teeth and stuff, we can work on all sorts of facial expressions. We can make him angry by showing more teeth and stuff like that. And in the end, you want to try and link all of the facial expressions together. And the only way to actually get great facial expressions is by looking at a lot of references. And cartoons are incredible for that because they over exaggerate facial expressions. So it's easy to see how they interpret the I completely messed up that word. Doesn't matter. How they, for example, show different facial expressions. And there's always a lot of different stuff going on as well. All right. So, for example, in a sad facial expression, you could also have a different tail position, or you could even have different position of the legs. So let's say we want this sad one, completely sad, and let's go to sculpt mode. Let's go to the snake hook, and we can make the Totoro, for example, be a little bit shorter and more like hunched down like that. And that's all going to be taken account into that same shape key, alright? So it's bored, it's hunched forwards a little bit, but if it's excited, it's going to be more upright. Like that. So the entire geometry will be taken into account into things like this, and that can be used to create facial expressions. Right, let's see how long we've been going. I think that is about 30 minutes. It has been a long time on those facial expressions, but it's just a lot of fun to work with. And you can add as many as you want and switch between them, combine them, make them boards and stuff like that. And it's a very nice way to control different things in your mesh. Alright, so that's where I'm gonna end it today. Next time we'll be adding those eyeballs. I know you like those now, Maple. So we're gonna be creating those eyes in a biological way. So we're gonna actually try and stick a little bit to the biology of eyes as well. And we're gonna be adding some teeth then as well. And I guess after that we'll be starting out actually animating more of the characters so it can dance and walk and stuff like that. Alright, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Thank you. I don't have any questions, but I do know that I'm going to have a lot of fun with the shape keys, yeah, when I'm reaching this part, because this looks way too good.
I know, right? And it doesn't end there. It's a lot of I've used it for so many of my animations. The fun part is we could even apply, for example, the subdivision modifier, and I'm gonna delete my shape keys real quick and hope I save my file. I'm not sure. If we, for example, apply this and we want to have a shape key where Totoro is relaxed and one where he is like angry and muscular, we can, for example, add some muscles in the chest area, for example, and let's say we want to add some abs as well, like that. And we're just gonna create some abs real quick. That's a little bit too much for abs. So you can, for example, do it for the amount of muscles a character has as well. So when it flexes, he has a lot of muscles, and then when he relaxes, it's just gonna be the plain old Totoro, right? So you can use those shape keys for a huge amount of purposes. So just try to play around with that. I'll set this real quick before I lose my basic Totoro. There we go. All right. So